Hello everyone and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Baldur's Gate, a role-playing game developed by BioWare and published by Interplay Entertainment in 1998 for the Microsoft Windows computer platform, with a Mac OS port following in the year 2000. We're going to look at that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 122. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean, Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games broadly. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate is a role-playing game developed by BioWare and published by Interplay Entertainment in 1998 for the Microsoft Windows computer platform, with a macOS port following in the year 2000. Before we can talk about Baldur's Gate, we need to take a step back to look at the game's original creative team, BioWare. Because Baldur's Gate represents an incredibly important release in the computer role-playing game genre, and surprisingly, was just the second game released by that company. Our story begins not with the game development studio, however, but with a trio of recent medical school graduates who, having just officially become practicing doctors, were looking for a way to expand their passion for video games into something more than passive entertainment. These three recent graduates, Ray Musica, Greg Zeschuk, and Augustine Yip, all attended the University of Alberta together, and while at the university formed a strong friendship and oftentimes worked together on both scholarly and academic pursuits, as well as more recreational activities. Interestingly, Musica, Zeschuk, and Yip, despite being focused on the medical field, also had an interest in computer programming, and while in medical school, the trio developed a medical simulation program called Acid-Base Simulator, which, despite the catchy name, was in actuality a highly technical and chemistry-centric software system that the team believed would be helpful for furthering their own studies. It's not clear whether Acid-Base Simulator became anything more than a hobbyist-level piece of software, but regardless, it represents the first time Musica, Zeschuk, and Yip would create an actual working computer program. As the group of friends continued their medical education and eventually graduated, they decided to go off and become full-fledged doctors, which is about the least surprising career choice for someone who successfully completes medical school. What was more surprising, though, was the fact that beyond their burgeoning medical practices, they still maintained an active interest in creating computer software, which is what led the team to make yet another medical-focused application, Gastroenterology Patient Simulator, which, despite the exciting premise, would never release on any home consoles during its lifetime. Okay, I know I'm kidding around a bit about the team's early software pursuits, but it's all meant in good fun. The simple fact is that Musica, Zeschuk, and Yip were intelligent guys whose interest in both the medical profession and software engineering would allow them to create some highly specialized, if not exactly widely distributed, pieces of software. The thing is, though, while Musica, Zeschuk, and Yip were all successful doctors with continued scholarly and medical pursuits squarely on their future career roadmaps, it was their recreational pursuits that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. For many individuals who grew up as teenagers in the 1980s, free time was spent doing one of several different activities. Some individuals would spend time at local arcades, dropping quarter after quarter into the newest video game releases in the hopes of obtaining a spot on a high-score leaderboard. Other teenagers might pursue more physical activities like sports or participate in a variety of extracurricular activities with friends, forming bonds that could potentially last forever. Other teenagers, however, might be focused on more fantasy-themed endeavors, and for those individuals, there was one pastime that ruled them all: the tabletop role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was originally created by Gary Gygax and Dave Aronson back in 1974, and was designed as a way for players to have a structured, fantasy-driven role-playing experience with friends and colleagues, where each game a player might partake in was limited only by the imagination of its participants. Gygax and Aronson envisioned a world that was populated by a variety of creatures and people, with an expansive lore and rule set that would provide a framework for the game, but would otherwise provide a sandbox for creative players to interact with and form their own adventures. Unlike traditional military-themed tabletop games, which were prevalent at the time with their focus on strategy and squad-based combat, the driving force for Dungeons & Dragons would be decidedly more personal, with players having the ability to create their own characters and develop their skills and personalities over the course of many adventures, oftentimes forming a party of unique, and sometimes conflicting, adventurers alongside friends, all in the hopes of completing quests, acquiring loot, and eventually becoming heroes of the realm. Musica, Zeschuk, and Yip had always been enamored by Dungeons & Dragons, and while the three first met each other while attending the University of Alberta, it didn't take long before they realized that they all shared a common interest. Each of them loved playing tabletop RPGs, and once they learned of that shared passion, the trio began partaking in their own adventures and campaigns, often as a way of relieving the stress associated with the rigors of a medical school education. Even beyond those pen and paper campaigns, though, the group of friends also enjoyed playing computerized versions of role-playing games. And while the concept of multiplayer RPGs in the early 90s wasn't really a thing, outside of online multi-user dungeons or MUDs, that didn't stop Musica, Zestchik, and Yip from sharing tales of their digital exploits, oftentimes playing through similar games independently before discussing them collaboratively. This shared passion for both tabletop and computer role-playing games would pervade their entire friendship, and in 1994, as the finishing touches were being put on Gastroenterology Patient Simulator, the trio began to consider that they might be able to take their love of gaming to the next level. Despite everyone on the team having a background in medicine and computer software development, they eventually decided that developing medical software just wasn't all that fun. Sure, the potential real-world application and benefit associated with creating a meaningful program for the medical profession was exciting, but the act of creating that software? That was decidedly less exciting. So, Ray Musica, Greg Zestchik, and Augustine Yip, alongside several family members and close friends, including Trent Oster, Brent Oster, and Marcel Zestchuk, decided to pivot away from medical-based software and into the more uncertain, though undeniably more fun, world of video game development. They pooled their resources, coming up with $100,000 in funding, and decided to form their own company in the hopes of becoming a successful video game development studio, which is what ultimately led to the creation of the company known as BioWare in 1995. Interestingly, despite everyone's belief that they could potentially make a name for themselves in the video game market, the founding members of the company continued to actively practice medicine as they began creating their very first video game experiences. And honestly, it's not hard to see why they would want to continue being doctors, at least for the time being. The team had achieved a pretty high level of success in the medical profession in a relatively short period of time, and entering the video game industry in the mid-90s, regardless of the amount of latent talent you might have, was anything but a guarantee of success. The thought was, if this whole video game thing didn't materialize into something of value, that'd be okay, as all they'd have to do is go back to their medical careers and fall back on that. Sure, they'd be out some money, but they could always earn that back in time. If they did eventually become successful in the video game industry, though, then the potential for even greater earnings was a definite possibility. That's all putting the cart before the horse, though, because at the time that BioWare was incorporated, they didn't even have a game concept to begin working on yet. They knew they wanted to create something that would demonstrate the company's internal talent, and they realized that their first title would need to have an impact in order to help them be taken seriously in the video game industry. But they still needed to come up with an idea. As the team was playing around with various concepts and prototypes, they started developing a fairly advanced simulation for terrain deformation, meaning a game engine where the physical environment was, at least to a degree, destructible, which was a unique feature during this time, as most game environments were fairly static, outside of pre-scripted events and potentially some light destructibility like the ability to break windows. The team at BioWare envisioned something different. They wanted to create an engine where the player's direct actions could cause a change in the environment, which they believed would lead to additional engagement and ultimately higher interest in any game that would potentially use that engine. It didn't take long before the team came up with a concept centered on mech robot combat, where errant shots from player weaponry could potentially create impact craters in the environment, and enemy mechs could themselves be damaged by incoming fire, with weapons and other accessories able to be destroyed and blown off their mech chassis through careful player targeting. Believing this framework would be a fun concept to base a game around, the team at BioWare sent demos to 10 different video game publishers in the hopes of reaching a deal, and out of those 10 publishers, 7 returned with publishing deals. It turns out, BioWare was seemingly onto something with their unique take on the mech combat genre. BioWare would eventually decide to partner with Interplay Entertainment to develop the concept into a full-fledged game, which would over time come to be known as Shattered Steel. Work on Shattered Steel would complete in 1996, and shortly thereafter, it would be released for the MS-DOS computer platform, garnering a moderate amount of critical praise, with many declaring the deformable environment and unique action-oriented take on mech combat to be something that most players would likely enjoy, though there were some critiques that the game wasn't nearly as complex or deep as other mech combat games, like the insanely popular MechWarrior series. If you wanted a pure action-driven mech combat experience, though, Shattered Steel would certainly suffice. While Shattered Steel would achieve a modicum of success, selling almost 200,000 copies over its lifetime, BioWare had loftier goals and aspirations. They wanted to become a household name, and it was clear that Shattered Steel, while an impressive freshman effort from the company, was not the game that was going to get them there. Interestingly, BioWare as a company was also in the process of evolving, as several of its founding members had broken off to form their own development studio, with the core trio of Ray Muzica, Greg Zeschik, and Augustine Yip remaining as the primary leadership team at the company, who would, hopefully, help BioWare reach even greater levels of success in the future. The good news for BioWare is that Shattered Steel performed well enough for Interplay to continue to want to act as a publishing partner. And with that partnership in place, the team began thinking about what their next title was going to be, and there were a couple of potential options on the table. They could continue to make action-oriented titles like Shattered Steel and hopefully improve upon the unique features of that game's engine to garner even greater sales in the future. Or they could try something entirely different, with the only question being what that different thing would actually be. BioWare was, if nothing else, open to trying new things, so it was quickly decided that the team would turn their attention away from action and instead would begin looking at the potential of creating a computerized role-playing game. And here, the team actually had a fair amount of prior experience, not necessarily in creating an RPG, but in actively playing multiple RPGs over the last 15 years. Recall that BioWare's co-founders, Muzica, Zeschik, and Yip, had all previously enjoyed playing tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, as well as exploring computerized versions of RPGs that had pervaded the computer gaming scene of the late 80s and early 90s. Well, what if they could take their love of RPGs, and the inherent strategy included in those titles, and create, themselves, a brand new strategic RPG experience? They certainly had the passion to create something worthwhile. The only question was, would they be able to create something that would be interesting to players around the world? The future was decidedly uncertain, though Interplay, for its part, had faith in the team to come up with something meaningful. This faith is what led Interplay to fund BioWare during a period of what they called exploratory development, where Interplay basically asked BioWare to develop several different prototypes for a potential next title, with Interplay acting as a sounding board for what they thought might be worth developing into a full-fledged game in the future. So, the team at BioWare began prototyping various experiences and developing various game engine and design concepts, with work eventually coalescing around a real-time strategy game that they believed could potentially take the market by storm. This prototype, which the team internally named Battleground Infinity, was designed to allow players to command units across a battlefield, while at the same time injecting some of the more personal touches that RPGs were known for, like specific character development and evolution over the course of the game. Powering this new real-time strategy experience would be a brand new engine, codenamed the Infinity Engine, owing to the fact that the game that would first utilize it was, in fact, named Battleground Infinity. The team at BioWare thought they had a hit on their hands, so they packaged up the prototype and went to Interplay to show them what they had created, hoping that Interplay would agree to fund development on a full game based on that concept. They showed the demo to Interplay, and Interplay basically said, maybe. It wasn't like Interplay didn't see the potential here, and the prototype itself ran well and had interesting gameplay mechanics, which Interplay believed could make for a solid gaming experience. The issue was, Interplay wasn't convinced that the technology BioWare demonstrated would make for a really interesting real-time strategy game. And here, we only need to look at the RTS landscape of the time to understand why there might have been some hesitation on the part of Interplay leadership. The real-time strategy genre of the mid-90s had become fairly popular amongst many gamers, with titles like Warcraft and Command & Conquer defining the standards by which nearly every future RTS title would be measured against. To say that both titles were successful would be an understatement, with Command & Conquer in particular having sales nearing 2 million copies in just the year following its release, which means that any new RTS entering the market would face some pretty stiff competition. It's not like the market was 100% dominated by Westward Studios and their Command & Conquer behemoth, mind you. It's just that for an unproven commodity like the title BioWare was proposing, there'd be a significant uphill battle to gain any sort of foothold in the genre. Less competitive, and infinitely more diverse, was the computer role-playing game space, which had over time seen cyclical growth and decline periods from the early 80s through the mid-90s. At its height, you had such heavyweights as the Ultima and Wizardry series, both of which had been heavily inspired by tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the Elder Scrolls series, which was one of the titles heralded as the future of the RPG genre when it was released in 1994. But across all of these titles, as well as numerous others, the overall popularity of the RPG genre was moderate at best, especially in comparison to more arcade action-based titles. At the same time, in the early to mid-90s, you also had brand new experiences like first-person shooters, which were rapidly gaining a foothold in the industry and, in the process, causing a wholesale shift for many companies and their own development roadmaps. Companies that were once heavily invested in developing games with deeper stories and complex mechanics were now beginning to explore more action-oriented affairs, simply because that was the flavor of the day, and for gamers across the world, it tasted delicious. That's not to say that there weren't companies who remained focused on delivering less action-focused, more strategic titles, with one of those companies who didn't jump on the arcade action bandwagon being Strategic Simulations Incorporated, or SSI. SSI was founded in 1979, and from its earliest days was focused on creating games that attempted to bring the tabletop strategy wargaming experience to home computers. From its founding through the mid-80s, SSI rapidly established itself as the expert at delivering well-crafted strategic titles to wargamers around the world, with numerous publications declaring SSI to be far more talented than its nearest competition, oftentimes referring to the company as being in a class of its own when it came to strategic wargaming on personal computers. Interestingly, SSI would eventually branch out to other tangential, albeit less war-centric games, and in 1984 would dive into the computer role-playing space with the release of Questron, the company's very first RPG. As with any new endeavor, expectations around the new game were tempered by realism. SSI was releasing a title in a genre they were unfamiliar with, and while they had high hopes for success, they also knew that breaking into a new gaming genre was not without risk. After Questron was released, any concerns around the viability of SSI's RPG pursuits quickly evaporated, as the title would sell almost 35,000 copies, becoming the fastest-selling game in the company's history up to that point, as well as outselling nearly any other title they had created by a factor of 3 to 1. SSI's first RPG was an unmitigated success. And with that success, SSI continued to expand its focus on the RPG genre, and future efforts within the company would be split between their traditional strategic wargaming titles and leading-edge role-playing experiences. SSI's expanding and talented staff, as well as the continued attention it placed on developing RPGs, would eventually allow SSI to acquire the coveted Dungeons & Dragons license for use in future computer role-playing games, beating out industry heavyweights like Origin Systems, Electronic Arts, and Sierra, primarily because of their expertise in the strategy and RPG space around this time. From 1987 on, and with license in hand, SSI would become the developer responsible for bringing the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop RPG experience into the digital era of entertainment. SSI set out to begin creating a series of RPGs using the Dungeons & Dragons rule set and campaign scenarios, resulting in the collection of games most affectionately referred to as the Gold Box series, which was named after the distinct gold color of the game's boxes. The Gold Box series became synonymous with high-quality, hardcore computer role-playing experiences, and from 1988 to 1993, 14 distinct titles, many of which utilized the D&D license, were released to gamers around the world. When the time came for SSI to renew the Dungeons & Dragons license, however, the company hesitated. Like we talked about, RPGs were beginning to fall a bit out of favor as the mid-90s approached, and when compared to the action-oriented titles ruling the market, sales just could not keep up. Despite the quality of SSI's releases, they continued to see a downward sales trend for their RPG titles, which is what led to them ultimately abandoning the D&D license in 1994. One company, however, still thought there was merit in the D&D license, as the tabletop version of the game had never really waned in popularity, despite the downturn in computer RPG sales. As SSI was deciding not to renew the Dungeons & Dragons license, software publisher Interplay decided to enter the ring, and right after SSI abandoned D&D, Interplay became its new digital steward. As Interplay was looking at BioWare's prototype for their proposed real-time strategy game, Battleground Infinity, the leadership team at the company came up with an idea. The Infinity Engine, while seemingly a fine piece of technology for real-time strategy gaming, felt like it might be more at home delivering a full-fledged RPG experience. And Interplay had just acquired one of, if not the biggest RPG license in the world. What if, rather than focus on creating a real-time strategy game, the team at BioWare could be convinced to take Interplay's newly acquired D&D license and turn it into a brand new computer role-playing game experience? Well, it didn't take much convincing for BioWare to abandon Battleground Infinity as a concept, instead turning their attention to the creation of a fully licensed Dungeons & Dragons computer RPG, still using the Infinity Engine, but with all of the staples of the RPG genre that you'd otherwise expect, like experience and levels, party-based combat, a deep and engaging story set in the Forgotten Realms D&D campaign universe, and a variety of enemies to defeat, situations to talk yourself out of, and environments to explore. The team at BioWare had long loved the D&D tabletop experience, and they now had the opportunity, with just their second game, to create their own D&D computer title for the world to hopefully enjoy. That game, as you likely guessed, would eventually come to be known as Baldur's Gate. Over the next 3 years, the team at BioWare would balloon to over 60 individuals, all of whom were fully dedicated to the creation of Baldur's Gate. The feeling amongst the team was one of excitement, and nearly every single member of the team was incredibly anxious about creating a game using the revered D&D license, with some members of the team even taking the time to read every single Forgotten Realms book that had ever been written, simply to get a better understanding of the lore and setting in the hopes of translating that rich literary and tabletop background into a fully realized computer-based setting, unlike anything players had seen before. Beyond taking inspiration from D&D itself, the team at BioWare also enjoyed playing computer role-playing games like we talked about before, and one game in particular was a favorite amongst the team, the post-apocalyptic title, Wasteland. Released in 1988, Wasteland would become one of the most influential computer role-playing games ever released, with a focus on delivering a persistent world where player choice mattered, and these core concepts were ones that the Baldur's Gate team wanted to reflect in their own game's design. And speaking of design, the game's Infinity Engine would have to have a number of changes implemented to encompass the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, which in the mid-90s was still focused on what was known as the Second Edition. For those who may be unaware, Dungeons & Dragons, as well as many other tabletop RPGs, routinely release updated rule sets for their titles, oftentimes with a number of updates that might include new classes, different abilities, refined mechanics, and a number of other changes that can drastically affect how a game is played. When Baldur's Gate was being developed, the second edition rule set was the most popular version of D&D being played, so it stands to reason that that rule set is what BioWare would base their game on. There was just one issue with that decision. A tabletop RPG rule set is pretty darn complex, and the team at BioWare didn't want to simply create a generic fantasy-themed RPG, slap a D&D license on it, and call it a day. They wanted to recreate the feeling of playing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, complete with all of the complexity that the underlying rule set requires. This led the Infinity Engine to be updated over the course of the game's development, so much so that by the end of the development cycle, BioWare had effectively completely recreated the D&D rule set in a digital form, with all of the pros and cons that such a strict conversion would include. For their part, BioWare did take some creative license with various aspects of the rule set that might not really create a worthwhile experience for a computer gamer, but for the most part, the goal was to truly recreate Dungeons & Dragons in digital form. Bringing the world of Baldur's Gate to life would involve the work of various artists who, unlike other RPGs of the time, designed each and every location throughout the game as a series of handcrafted backgrounds, as opposed to a tile-driven toolset that typically assists with speedy asset creation, but can sometimes make different locations feel a bit less real than a more direct, custom approach. While the end result of this effort was a series of scenes that all felt distinct, the downside was felt in the time required to actually create that artwork, which significantly impacted the game's proposed release schedule. Interplay, for its part, gave BioWare a significant amount of latitude to create the game they wanted to make, with BioWare co-founder Ray Musica explaining that both Interplay and BioWare collaborated very closely together to create the game, which from both sides was a true passion project for all involved. While there were certainly deadlines that needed to be met, which did result in BioWare simplifying some of its original design, the overall approach to creating Baldur's Gate was one of collaboration, and because of that close relationship between BioWare and Interplay, the majority of the production proceeded without any significant issues or hiccups. Eventually, work on the title would complete, and Baldur's Gate would be released on the Microsoft Windows computer platform on December 21st, 1998, just in time for the holidays. The only question was, would BioWare's second game make a mark on the industry? Internal expectations at Interplay were very low, because not only was this just the second game released by BioWare, but the RPG market in general had become much less popular in the years following their acquisition of the D&D license. Interplay was hoping for a moderate success, which from their perspective would have equated to around 200,000 total lifetime sales. Enough to justify work on a sequel while still generating some profit and proving that the money spent on the D&D license itself was worth it. Well, a strange thing happened when Baldur's Gate was finally released. Rather than sell at a steady rate en route to a couple 100,000 units sold, Baldur's Gate sold out its initial production run of 50,000 copies effectively overnight, with every single copy sold within the first week of its release. In less than a year, Baldur's Gate would sell over 1 million copies en route to almost 3 million copies sold in the years following its release, completely blowing Interplay's expectations out of the water and firmly making BioWare a company to watch in the computer role-playing game space. One of the reasons the game sold so well was the fact that it was so widely praised by the critical community upon its release, with countless reviewers and publications declaring Baldur's Gate to be one of the finest computer role-playing games ever created. The majority of critics praised nearly every aspect of the experience, from the graphics to the complexity to the degree of choice prevalent throughout the whole game, with many saying that this was now the standard by which all future role-playing games would be measured. While there were some critiques, specifically around the graphics quality of the individual character models, which some felt looked a bit pixelated, and the artificial intelligence pathfinding for computer-controlled party members, which some felt didn't always perform as expected, those were considered minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. Baldur's Gate would end up winning a ton of Best Games of the Year awards, and would, in later years, be recognized as one of the best games of all time. As you might expect, given a runaway success like that, Baldur's Gate would spawn both an expansion pack, Tales of the Sword Coast, a direct sequel, Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn, itself with its own expansion pack, Throne of Baal, as well as a number of spin-off titles set in the overarching Baldur's Gate universe. From the humble beginnings of simply being a new game studio's second game, Baldur's Gate would go on to become a massive gaming franchise, and in the process, would almost single-handedly revitalize the computer RPG market. After the release and success of Baldur's Gate 2, work quickly began on yet another sequel set in the Baldur's Gate universe, entitled Baldur's Gate 3: The Black Hound. This new Baldur's Gate adventure would present a shift to using fully three-dimensional visuals as opposed to a more isometric perspective, and would fully embrace D&D's 3rd edition rule set, which included various game mechanic changes that the game's developer, Black Isle Studios, intended to build into the title. But ultimately, this version of Baldur's Gate would never come to be, and from my perspective, this was likely a blessing in disguise, as the game would have been completely standalone from the original Baldur's Gate games, using the name solely because Interplay could still make games in the Baldur's Gate universe, but otherwise had lost the D&D license to rival publishing company Atari. While I'm sure there were some good intentions here, the whole premise sounds like a cash grab to me, and if so, would have likely ended up sullying the Baldur's Gate pedigree. After that cancellation, the potential of Baldur's Gate 3 becoming a reality would wane, though interest in the first 2 games in the series would continue to remain, until eventually in 2012, a company by the name of Overhaul Games would take it upon themselves to create enhanced versions of both Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2, adding additional content and releasing the 2 enhanced titles on most modern gaming platforms. Overhaul Games, interestingly, is made up of a bunch of BioWare alumni, including prior co-founder Trent Oster, so there is definitely some history here. With both enhanced titles receiving a fair amount of attention and achieving successful sales figures, discussions once again sprung up about the potential of a Baldur's Gate 3, a true sequel to the original Baldur's Gate duology, only this one to be created by Overhaul Games and its BioWare pedigree. Work on that title would never really reach full-fledged production, as the company would eventually lose the rights to develop games based on the Baldur's Gate license, and any possibility of a Baldur's Gate 3 seemed, once again, to be a distant hope rather than an eventual reality. That would all change in 2019 though, which is when it was revealed that Larian Studios, the company behind the beloved Divinity Original Sin series of RPGs, had been granted the Baldur's Gate license and would ultimately be the studio responsible for finally bringing Baldur's Gate 3 to life. After that initial unveiling, it would take another 4 years of development, including a prolonged early access period, before Baldur's Gate 3 would finally make its way into gamers' hands around the world. Finally, in August of 2023, Baldur's Gate 3 would release on the market, and in the process, the world was introduced to one of the finest RPGs to ever be created in the history of gaming. That, however, is a story for a different day. With Baldur's Gate, BioWare would set itself on a trajectory to become one of the premier role-playing game development studios in the world, and would hone their craft over multiple releases, most of which were widely considered to be some of the best games available in the genre. Titles like Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, Jade Empire, Dragon Age, and others proved that BioWare was a force to be reckoned with, and they achieved a significant amount of praise and respect for the quality of their releases over the years. Nowadays, BioWare isn't quite as well regarded, though I personally hold out hope that the company will rise from its current predicament to once again grace the world with its unique take on computer role-playing game experiences. While all of its original founders, to the best of my knowledge, are no longer with the company, the pedigree of success that was fostered under their leadership hopefully still remains ingrained in the DNA of those who remain. Baldur's Gate is quite literally one of the most important releases in computer game history. As the title that reignited gamers' passion for deep, complex computer RPG experiences, as well as the game that would make BioWare a top company in the industry, Baldur's Gate has had a long and lasting legacy that continues to be felt even today. Even titles like Baldur's Gate 3, which was one of the most critically acclaimed titles of all time, owes their existence to Baldur's Gate, not only because of the setting and characters, but because of the overarching game design concepts that permeated the title. The reason Larian Studios itself exists and has devoted themselves to creating worthwhile RPG experiences over the years is largely due to Baldur's Gate existing in the first place. Without Baldur's Gate, who knows what the computer RPG genre would look like today. Luckily, that's not something we have to worry about, as Baldur's Gate does in fact exist, and we are all the better for it. Baldur's Gate is the kind of title whose significance has transcended the time in which it was released, and as such is certainly a game that will likely be remembered for all time. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Baldur's Gate today versus when it was released over 25 years ago. Baldur's Gate, at its core, is a fairly hardcore computer role-playing game, or CRPG, which comes with some specific considerations and features that serve to make it a bit different than the traditional console RPGs we've looked at on prior episodes of the podcast. While today, the concept of a CRPG versus a console RPG isn't really a valid comparison, considering most consoles are just specialized computers, and many titles are now released on every platform available, back in the 90s, there was a very real distinction between CRPGs and the majority of console-based RPGs of the time. The main difference from a historical perspective has to do with depth and level of complexity, which was driven, at least in part, by the control mechanics of both computer and console RPGs. Most console RPGs of the 80s and 90s presented a fairly accessible role-playing system for players to enjoy, with a handful of easily understandable stats that, for the most part, would directly impact a player's overall defensive, offensive, and support capabilities. In many console RPGs of the time, you didn't really create your character or party, but were instead given a pre-made character, with any sort of stat deviations from the baseline occurring as a result of leveling up or acquiring new equipment which might be more powerful than whatever you had been using previously. For the most part, in console RPGs, equipment upgrades, side grades, and downgrades were pretty easy to analyze, and oftentimes you could very clearly see when one piece of equipment was better than another. Many console RPGs allowed for both melee and magical combat, and while some of the more advanced RPGs, like those by companies like Squaresoft and Enix, included a number of status effects and counters for those effects, along with some degree of player specialization, many other RPGs were far simpler, effectively boiling down combat, upgrades, and leveling into a series of ever-increasing numbers, without much in the way of build diversity ever becoming a consideration. Computer RPGs, by contrast, were much more complex affairs, oftentimes with a number of stats, substats, skills, subskills, and equipment that would impact one or more of those stats or skills, perhaps to the detriment of other stats and skills. Whereas in most console RPGs, you'd need to pay attention to a handful of attributes as you made your way through the game, computer RPGs required much more in-depth knowledge of the game's mechanics and underlying systems, and in fact, it wasn't uncommon for some early computer role-playing games to drive players to develop spreadsheets and hand-drawn notes, complete with complex calculations, just to manage their party of adventurers. Many CRPGs, given the fact that they were playable on a computer, often used complex control schemes as well, with micromanaging of party members possible through the use of the mouse and keyboard control scheme, which made individual party member selection much easier than what you might find on consoles of the time. And, perhaps most importantly, CRPGs supported the concept of character builds, with multiple races, classes, attributes, and skill loadouts, with players being able to choose what combination of all of those features they would put together for their player-made character and parties, making it so that a playthrough by one person might be, in many cases, dramatically different than a playthrough by another person. Even beyond those core concepts, CRPGs also often offered branching narratives, or at least some degree of player choice, oftentimes with some form of reputation or karma system to denote whether someone was a quote-unquote good guy or bad guy. The bottom line is that, generally speaking, if you wanted a fairly straightforward, albeit narrative-heavy RPG experience in the 80s and 90s, you played a console RPG. If you wanted a more in-depth and complex experience that required more of your attention and time, CRPGs were the way to go. I mention all of that to say that Baldur's Gate is most certainly part of the CRPG camp, with a complex gameplay system based on the Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rule set that, if you've never played it before, is likely a bit more complicated than what you might expect. Like we talked about earlier, Baldur's Gate is a true digital recreation of the tabletop system that Dungeons & Dragons had popularized, and while various mechanics are hidden from view, the underlying framework and structure for the game is very much inspired from those tabletop roots. As an example, in tabletop D&D, the dice roll is pretty much the ruler of all, in that every action you take, every dialogue you encounter, every monster you fight, pretty much everything you do in a D&D tabletop game is dictated by how well you roll your set of dice, be they 6, 8, 10, or 12-sided. While playing Baldur's Gate, you won't see a digital representation of those dice rolls, but all of the internal game mechanics do in fact use D&D appropriate dice rolls to determine the success or failure of each action in the game world. To see this in action, all you need to do is take a look at any weapon you may have equipped, where the weapon's damage numbers are likely listed as something like 1d6 plus 2. What that means, in general terms, is that every time you swing your weapon, your damage will be determined by rolling a 6-sided die, and then adding 2 to that resulting number to get your final damage output. So let's say you roll a 3. Well, your final damage value will be a 5, or 3 plus 2. While the game doesn't explicitly show these dice rolls happening, they do in fact occur behind the scene, and they add a level of both familiarity and credibility to the game, especially for anyone who may have cut their teeth playing dice-based tabletop games previously. Now, if all you needed to worry about was your weapon's damage rating and resulting dice roll, the game's combat system would be a pretty darn simple experience. But in reality, there's a lot more complexity here, as not only do you need to worry about your weapon's stats, but you also have to look at your overall attributes, which, if they're high enough, might apply a modifier to your weapon roll. And then you have to look at your enemy's THAC0 level, which stands for 2-Hit Armor Class 0, which means what roll you need to make in order to hit an enemy with an armor class rating of 0, which is considered the baseline, so to speak, in D&D's 2nd edition world. And then you need to apply any related attribute modifiers that your enemy might have. And then you need to take into account any buffs or debuffs that might be on your character or your enemy. And then, well, you get the picture. The D&D combat system is incredibly deep, and the fact that BioWare was able to replicate such depth in Baldur's Gate while simplifying the overall mechanics to make it easier to understand for computer gamers is certainly an impressive feat. The majority of the uniqueness of Baldur's Gate's combat system does in fact originate from the Dungeons & Dragons combat system, including limited spell slots with the need to rest in order to recover spells, the inclusion of multiple classes and races, each of whom have specific attributes that may affect your character, a number of weapon specialization options which allow you to further tailor your character based on which weapon or weapons you want them to be most proficient with, and the concept of dual and multi-classing, where you can combine the skills of multiple classes together to create hybrid builds that, while restricted by total experience points being distributed between two classes, offer synergies that can potentially make ultra-powerful builds possible. That is to say, a full discussion of the Baldur's Gate combat system would, by necessity, require a deep dive into every aspect of the D&D combat system, which is well beyond the scope of what I intend to cover here. What I will say, though, is that the combat system is incredibly deep, and if you take the time to really study what options are available to you while seeking out the equipment that best maximizes the skills of your specific build, you can make an incredibly powerful character, and by extension, party of characters, to tackle the game's content with. And speaking of your party, Baldur's Gate is designed around the concept of group combat. And over the course of your adventure, you'll encounter numerous potential companions, each of whom may align or not align with your overall build and personality alignment. In Baldur's Gate, you have several different options for defining the personality of your character. You can denote your character as being lawful, neutral, or chaotic, and then you can classify your character's tendencies as being either good, neutral, or evil, which when combined make up the overall alignment of your character. As you might imagine, certain alignments work really well together, while others, not so much. This comes into play when selecting your companions, where if you are, let's say, a lawful good paladin, you probably won't get along too well with a chaotic evil warrior. In fact, the degree of difference between your alignments can drive certain companions to not join you, or even potentially leave your party entirely, assuming you perform actions that are counter to their overall alignment. Those actions, by the way, contribute to the karma system in the game, where the more good actions you take, the greater people respect and admire you, while taking evil actions decrease your karma and make you a target for bounty hunters and law enforcers across the game world. I always enjoy a game that has a karma system in place, and while I typically play a good guy in RPGs, I love whenever a game includes multiple ways to play through the experience, so Baldur's Gate definitely checked that box for me. Beyond character alignment and the companions at your disposal, we also should talk about the world of Baldur's Gate, which is, to put it mildly, massive. The game is split up into a series of zones, so to speak, each of which are accessible via an overworld map that shows where each zone is in relation to one another. The cool thing here is that when you first start the game, most zones are entirely hidden from view, and only the most prominent landmarks in the game's world will appear on your game's map. As you explore the world and attempt to exit various zones from different sides of the map, you'll slowly uncover more zones to explore, until finally, by the end of the game, you have a ridiculously populated map without much in the way of white space anywhere to be found. The number of zones in the game is truly impressive, and even more impressive is the fact that many of the zones in the game, a good chunk of which are classified as wilderness areas, are entirely optional to explore. Now, you might think that optional content would simply contain a couple of combat encounters or areas to farm experience points, and that'd be that. But no, in Baldur's Gate, there are entire multi-step side quests hidden in nondescript, entirely optional zones. And while you could play the game with a focus on the main quest, the best way to play the game, from my perspective, is to explore every nook and cranny of the game's world, because you never know what cool new item, interesting enemy encounter, or villager in distress you might come upon, and nearly every interaction in the game is a worthwhile one. Another reason you may want to explore as much as possible is the fact that the game, especially in the early going, is incredibly challenging, with combat encounters that will likely decimate you without a second thought, at least until you gain some upgraded equipment and get some additional levels and skills under your belt. The way combat works in the game, other than the behind-the-scenes dice rolls, is actually mostly real-time, which is a bit of a shift from other CRPGs like Fallout that employed a turn-based system. In Baldur's Gate, you can assign commands to each of your party members, and they'll carry out those commands to the best of their ability. Or you can assign an artificial intelligence profile to a party member, which will make them behave semi-autonomously depending on which profile you select. Let me be clear though, the AI routines here are not the greatest, and your best bet at success in combat is actually to micromanage your party, which luckily the game allows you to do fairly easily, as you can hit the spacebar at any point in your adventure to pause the action, allowing you to queue up commands for each member of your party, all of which will be executed once you unpause the game. I've got to say, I love this style of combat in CRPGs, and the ability to pause the game, assess the battlefield, strategize, determine a course of action, and then see it play out is pretty darn fulfilling, even if things don't always go to plan. And those plans, especially early on in your adventure, will go wrong. The early game in Baldur's Gate in particular is pretty darn unforgiving, and even for someone who has played the game before and is, generally speaking, fairly familiar with CRPG mechanics, I ended up dying a bunch in the earlier portions of the game. Eventually, you'll gain enough skills and powers to become a force to be reckoned with, at which point enemies become much more manageable. Though even after you become more powerful, there's still a very real possibility that you'll run into an even more powerful enemy, or get a couple of unlucky dice rolls and end up dying. And because combat is real-time other than when you pause the game, it's very possible for a couple of quick hits to come out of the blue, ending your adventure prematurely. Because death in Baldur's Gate is a significant issue, as you might expect, though what I mean is, death in Baldur's Gate is either downright game-ending, or at a minimum, a major inconvenience. If your main character dies at any point in your adventure, then that's it. It's game over, and you'll be forced to reload a saved game. I do have to question this design decision just a little bit, because like we talked about, you get access to a number of companion characters, and it is entirely possible for your party to be able to survive an encounter regardless of your own death. If one of your party members dies, you can resurrect them, but that involves making your way to one of several temples scattered throughout the game world to pay a fee to the local priest, after which he or she will resurrect your dead party member. I'm not sure why this same kind of setup couldn't have applied to your main character, other than perhaps because every aspect of the story was tied to your main character interacting with people, and perhaps having a party without a main character would break the game. I don't know. All I can say is, when you get an unlucky string of rolls on your main character and they die, forcing you to reload a prior save, it is kinda irritating. Though honestly, dying in general is really irritating, because unlike later games in the series, you won't be able to reach a high enough level in Baldur's Gate to be able to resurrect a companion with a memorized spell, or at least I don't think you can reach a high enough level to gain a res spell in Baldur's Gate 1. What this means is that anytime a companion dies, you need to stop what you're doing, go to a temple, which might be pretty far away, res that party member, and then re-equip that party member, because from what I could tell, everything you may be carrying drops to the ground when they die. Now, I suppose it's possible that there's some mechanic here that prevents you from having to loot a companion's corpse when they die, but I didn't want to chance losing their equipment. So I ended up picking up everything every time one of my companions died, which ended up encumbering my party, which once again was pretty irritating. This is one aspect of the game that I felt could have been streamlined just a little bit, because oftentimes the inconvenience of death is so high that I would simply reload a prior save rather than going through the pain of gathering a fallen companion's equipment, leaving my current zone, going to a temple, reviving my companion, re-equipping my companion, and then going back to wherever I was in the first place. It's not a major deal in the grand scheme of things, and I know death is supposed to be punishing. But at a certain point in the game, when money is not an issue, the whole resurrect process adds a bit of tedium to the experience. And that's not even considering the potential of one of your companions literally being exploded by an enemy, which if that happens means you cannot resurrect them, no matter what you do. Once I had the companions I wanted in my party, anytime one of them would die so hard that they couldn't be revived, I simply restored my last save, which is really your only recourse if you lose someone who you really want to keep along with you on your journey. The good news is that the more powerful you are, the more tools, spells, equipment, and skill you'll have at your disposal to avoid untimely deaths, at which point the game starts feeling a lot more streamlined to play. That's not to say that the game feels bad to play before then, it's just that you're going to face a lot more difficulty when you're less powerful. And the power differential between you and other creatures and characters is exacerbated here, because Baldur's Gate is not the kind of game where you'll eventually become a level 100 instrument of destruction. In fact, the maximum amount of experience you can gain in the game is surprisingly limited, and even if you had the expansion pack, Tales of the Sword Coast, you'd only be able to reach between level 8 and 10 depending on your class by the end of the game. Now, if you've played Dungeons & Dragons before, you'll realize that a level 10 character in D&D is in fact pretty darn powerful. But for its part, the game does a nice job of increasing difficulty as you play, making most encounters feel meaningful, a bit challenging, and ultimately rewarding. Though, like I mentioned, the early game experience is definitely harsher towards the player. Push through that though, and you'll find a truly rewarding set of encounters later on in the experience. Anyway, I've got a lot more to say about Baldur's Gate, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to look up. We didn't have the pervasive amount of information available to us at all points in time today. Back then, when we made a buying decision, oftentimes it was based on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from friends and family, and what the game box actually looked like in the store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Baldur's Gate, for the Windows computer platform, the back of the box says Forgotten Realms campaign setting, Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate takes you back to the Forgotten Realms campaign setting on a visually dazzling role-playing adventure, one that brings to life the grand tradition of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons game through cutting-edge art and technology. Immerse yourself in this quintessential medieval fantasy world, where entire nations hang in the balance of your actions, dark prophecies test your resolve, and heroic dreams can be fulfilled at last. And then some bullets. Huge game world! 5 CDs filled with nearly 10,000 scrolling game screens in lush 16-bit SVGA graphics. Gripping non-linear adventure that spans 7 chapters with dozens of subplots that branch in and out of the main scenario. Your decisions affect subsequent chapters and the entire game world as a whole. Set in TSR's best-selling Forgotten Realms campaign setting, the most popular of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game worlds. Explore hundreds of intricately rendered and visually stunning high-res buildings and structures. Taverns, temples, houses, arenas, stores, and brothels are meticulously created. Guide a party of up to 5 other characters, each with their own personalities and dispositions. Control party characters one at a time, or as a group. Create your character from a combination of 6 authentic AD&D races: human, elf, half-elf, dwarf, gnome, halfling, and 26 different classes. fighter, thief, cleric, mage, and subclasses such as druid and specialist mage. Features real-time environment effects such as rain, snow, and lightning, as well as interior and exterior lamps and magic spells. 6-player network play capability. Play cooperatively or forge your own destiny. And then there are also some screenshots on the back of the box, as well as a quote at the top from PC Gaming World, which says, "It's easily going to be the best AD&D computer role-playing game." And that is the back of the box for Baldur's Gate, and I have got to say, yep, this one sells me entirely. Baldur's Gate is one of those games that I did play a bunch of back when I was younger. I remember the box from back then. I have the box sitting on my shelf right now, and even more importantly, I actually remember the inside of the box a ton, more than what I typically do for a lot of these games. And the reason for that is simple. Back when I first bought Baldur's Gate, back when it first came out, my father, brother, and I had taken a trip to Disney World on a family vacation. And I remember during that vacation, anytime that there was downtime, I actually had the Baldur's Gate massive manual in front of me, and I was reading about Baldur's Gate. I was reading about the world of Dungeons & Dragons. I was reading about the game anytime I wasn't otherwise distracted by Mickey Mouse and friends. It is one of those things where the entire vacation, my brother and I would talk to each other about what we would do when we'd got home from vacation, how we would play Baldur's Gate, what characters we would make, how we would play through the game, hopefully in multiplayer. It was so much fun. It didn't truly distract me from vacation because I was really engaged in the vacation, but I can tell you that I remember that instruction manual so clearly, and it is something that even today I have fond memories of simply just reading the instructions. I know that goes beyond the whole concept of the back of the box review, but I have to say the back of the box absolutely sells me on the game. The rest of the contents in the box makes me love the game. Moving on from that, we're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Baldur's Gate all look excellent, with a handcrafted, gigantic world to explore with a ton of environmental details that make the game feel alive. Wandering around a wilderness area and coming upon a babbling brook, or a roaring waterfall, or even a deforested section of land, you can feel how lived in the world is. And unlike other games that might reuse assets from one zone to the next, Baldur's Gate's world feels unique every step of the way. Although I will say, there are a ton of wilderness zones in the game, and there are only so many ways you can make a forest feel distinct, but for their part, the art team behind Baldur's Gate did an admirable job of doing just that. For the more unique environments like cities, dungeons, towers, and other areas of interest, the design is almost universally remarkable, and I found myself getting lost in the game's world, not just because of the narrative and encounters found throughout the game, but simply because the environmental details and graphics design were both engaging and immersive. Character avatars, on the other hand, those are a bit lower detailed than I would have preferred. The disparity between how low detailed the character models are in comparison to the richness of the environments is actually kind of strange, but I suppose this was a conscious decision on BioWare's part to prioritize one over the other. Now, just to be clear, there is some variety in player character models, and a number of different pieces of equipment and weaponry will change the way you look in the game, not to mention the ability to select primary and secondary colors for your overall character model. It's just that the general lack of detail here sticks out a bit, especially in comparison to the rest of the game's artistic design. Animations, meanwhile, are a bit limited, which is likely a result of the same lower detail character models we were just talking about. It's not that the animations are bad, it's just that they're simple, and watching your character keep swinging a sword the same way, every swing, as he tries to hit the enemy in front of him, can sometimes feel like there's a lack of impact in combat. When you connect with a satisfying thwack, though, that feels really good, but that's more of a testament to the game's sound design as opposed to the animations. Though I will say, whenever you get a solid crit on a bad guy and they literally explode into a mess of body parts, that never gets old. I don't mean to sound psychotic, it's just that the game does a really good job demonstrating how visceral combat can be in those brief moments. For the most part, the game looks great, though there are some areas where it shows its age just a little bit. Definitely not enough to detract from the rest of the experience, but something to mention nonetheless. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Baldur's Gate is universally amazing, with a great mix of epic themes, heart-thumping combat tracks, and more subdued background sounds that really do immerse you in the game's world. There's not much to say about the music, because it is so good that I have literally never forgotten it over the years. It has remained a permanent part of my memory ever since I first played Baldur's Gate back in 1998, and it remains incredible to listen to, even today. Beyond the music, special mention has to be given to the game's sound effects, and in particular, the ambient sounds that are embedded in the various zones and environments you'll explore as you play the game. Perhaps more than the music, the ambient sounds really immerse you in the experience, to a degree that not many games can muster even today. The feeling of walking through a lush forest as birds chirp overhead and insects chitter nearby, with the far-off sound of a raging river and the din of a local village representing potential respite from the dangers of your adventure, is absolutely phenomenal. And the ambient sounds are mixed so well that you can even use the audio as a means of locating different features in the environment, simply by following the sounds. This is an area of the game that greatly impressed me, and the quality here makes Baldur's Gate feel more immersive than many modern titles. Truly awesome work by the game's sound designers. Baldur's Gate also includes some voice acting, which is, for the most part, fine for what it is. Other than a few cutscenes, you never really get an extended monologue or a ton of voice dialogue, with most characters in the game having a few lines they may speak when you first start a conversation with them, but otherwise, most dialogues are accomplished entirely with text. And you know what? That's entirely okay, as I wouldn't expect a late 90s RPG to have fully voiced dialogue. I will admit, though, that a good chunk of lines are repeated by various characters throughout the game, especially certain types of characters that are effectively cookie cutters of each other, like tavern keepers. If you've seen one tavern keeper, you've seen them all, and they often sound identical to one another. Not a huge deal, but similar to some of my other minor critiques, something to mention, especially when comparing the game to more modern titles. Overall, though, the game sounds great, and the music, sound effects, and ambient audio really do help bring you more into the game's world, which I absolutely loved. Moving on to the narrative and story, Baldur's Gate begins with you in Candlekeep, a walled-off fortress with a gigantic library providing refuge for a number of learned individuals who are attempting to decipher the hidden mysteries of the world. One of those individuals, a powerful spellcaster named Gorion, is your adoptive father. One day, you receive news from Gorion that you have to pack up your things and leave Candlekeep, the only home you've ever known. You gather your equipment, say your goodbyes, and leave with Gorion late that evening, only to be attacked on the road by a gang of thugs, including a heavily armored man who Gorion seems to know. Unfortunately, Gorion falls in battle, but luckily, he has some friends who he had previously instructed you to seek out upon his death. You narrowly escape death at the hands of the gang of thugs, and the next morning, you gather yourself and prepare to set off on an adventure, both to find Gorion's prior companions, assist the inhabitants of the land, and hopefully avenge Gorion's death. There is a huge world just waiting to be explored, and as one plot point leads to the next, you'll uncover more about not only the world around you, but also who you are, and what your role in that world may or may not be. The only question is, will you end up being the hero the world needs, or the villain the world wishes didn't exist? I've got to say, I loved this story, and all of the different twists and turns it takes from the beginning of the game all the way through to its very satisfying conclusion. There is a ton of detail here, along with side quests and lore that help to flesh out the world itself, while also providing a degree of additional context around the major issues facing the people who inhabit Baldur's Gate, and uncovering all of this information was a treat. The only aspect of the game's story that I wish was fleshed out just a bit more were the game's companions, some of whom have side stories and quests to tackle, but for the most part, your companions don't really have a ton of narrative or backstory behind them. After playing more modern RPGs that have deep companion plotlines, romances, quests, and interactions, you can definitely see that Baldur's Gate 1 was a bit less full-featured here, a deficit that would be addressed directly in Baldur's Gate 2. For the time, even Baldur's Gate 1's companion interactions were unlike anything players had seen before. But looking at it from a more modern perspective, it is a bit lacking. Overall though, the narrative, major plot points, and world story and lore all combine together to make a rich narrative tapestry that is a joy to experience and learn more about, and I simply loved it. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a fair amount about the general structure of the game and how it recreates the Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rule set in digital form, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. What we will talk about, though, are the general controls for the game, which I found to be fairly straightforward, especially considering the complexity and depth of most of the game's underlying mechanics. Pretty much everything you need to do in the game can be accomplished using your mouse, albeit with some keyboard shortcuts should you want to use them. Taking a look at the game's interface, there's a pretty good amount to take in, with a number of different buttons, screens, and embedded menus that all do different things. Some of them simply give you more information about your character, your current quests, or the game world in general, which are all useful, while other sections of the interface allow you to manage your character, your inventory, your companions, your spell loadout, and pretty much anything else you'd expect given a deep computer role-playing game. While the interface can seem overwhelming at first, it doesn't take long to get used to where everything is, and the mouse-driven interface feels entirely natural to navigate after you've played around with it for a little bit. For the most part, these controls feel entirely modern, though the interface itself is showing its age just a little bit, as more modern design principles have come to light that make navigating the complex aspects of most RPGs a bit simpler than what you might see in Baldur's Gate. It's still mostly accessible, even to gamers who haven't played a late 90s CRPG before, but it will take some getting used to if you're not already familiar with some of the more common aspects of that era's CRPGs. As far as playability and the way the game actually functions, almost everything is exactly what you would want from a deep CRPG experience, which is to say, it's awesome to experience even today. That said, there is one aspect of the game that I have a serious issue with. All of the critiques I've mentioned already, like some of the character graphics, the resurrection tedium, the early game difficulty, all of that stuff pales in comparison to the biggest issue in the game by far, and that is the AI pathfinding. I know, some of you might be thinking, wait a second, the pathfinding? That's the biggest issue in the game? And to that I would say, yes it is, because I truly believe Baldur's Gate, when taken as a whole, is one of the best RPGs of all time, and even during my most recent playthrough, I loved nearly everything about it. The one thing that made me more frustrated than anything else, and most demonstrates the fact that the game is over 25 years old, is the pathfinding. I cannot tell you how many times I would click on my party, and then click on an empty area of the map a bit further away, only to discover that my party decided to try to walk through an impassable mountain, simply standing in one spot, confused beyond belief. Or let's say I click a spot on the map that would require traversing a bridge over a river that might be, say, 20 feet away. Well, sometimes my party would use the bridge like normal people, while other times they'd simply walk to the edge of the river and stare at it, as though they had no clue how to possibly traverse the obstacle. Literally, there were times when a bridge might be visible on the screen, and my party would still not realize they needed to use it to cross to the other side. This might sound like a minor issue, but over the course of playing the whole game, the lack of quality pathfinding gets really old, especially because you will be exploring a ton of zones, and those zones are pretty darn large. I didn't mention it before, but every map area you access begins by being covered by a fog of war kind of overlay, where the zone's map only becomes visible to you as you explore each section of a given zone. If you're like me, you'll want to uncover every inch of that fog of war, which is made just a bit more tedious than it needed to be, simply because the pathfinding is as bad as it sometimes is. The act of exploring the zones themselves is amazing. It's just that the pathfinding can inject some frustration to the overall experience. Oh, I should also mention that there are a couple of dungeons that have ridiculously narrow passageways, which even more so demonstrates the deficiencies in the pathfinding system. And that's not even to mention the times when several party members couldn't figure out that they would need to move around other party members in order to attack a monster. In those instances, they kind of just stood there, staring at their buddies whacking away at a bad guy while they just did nothing. For what it's worth, it seemed like most of the issues with the pathfinding had to do with issuing commands to a group of companions, rather than micromanaging individual party members. But regardless, still a bit irritating to experience across the entirety of my playthrough. Other than that one aspect of the game though, Baldur's Gate is an amazing experience, and it's just as fun to experience today as it was back in 1998. So, what is our verdict on Baldur's Gate? Well, it's probably not a surprise, but Baldur's Gate is one of the finest RPGs ever created, and was an inspiration to countless future titles that went on to both refine and evolve the general formula Baldur's Gate originated. As one of the most important releases in the CRPG genre, and an incredible game in its own right, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Baldur's Gate has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. It is one of those experiences that everyone should experience at some point in their life, and even if you're not the biggest fan of CRPG-styled games, you still owe it to yourself to play this one, if only to see where nearly every modern CRPG got their inspiration from. Despite being over 25 years old, Baldur's Gate is a truly timeless classic, and as such is unquestionably a surefire inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Baldur's Gate. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun on a Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Dark Castle, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to build this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Dark Castle. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.